All right, it is 1:20, so I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Samara Fickner, and I'll be your session chair for today. The Southern Alberta Institute of Technology is excited to welcome Bill Black to the inaugural International Project Management Day Symposium. Just a little bit about our speaker today. He's a quantity surveyor from Scotland, celebrating 40 years in the construction industry this June. Bill has worked in a variety of roles and industry segments, including consulting, estimating, manufacturing, sales, business development, and executive leadership. Prior to taking up his role with the CCA, Bill accumulated a broad range of industry experience, including the commercial trade contractors in sectors such as roofing, cladding, and more, and 13 years in the commercial interiors and workplace industry with Howarth. In 2005, Bill co-founded the group Mindshift, a volunteer group made up of numerous industry stakeholders from across North America. This multidisciplined group was formed to study the many challenges facing the design and construction industry. In 2009, Bill and 3 other members of the group co-authored The Commercial Real Estate Revolution. Later that year, Mindshift won the Coronet Bruce H. Russell Global Innovators Award. Congratulations. Bill was also awarded the 2014 Calgary Construction Association Person of the Year Award in recognition of his diverse work to benefit the industry over the years, both locally and nationally. No stranger to the challenges of the commercial construction sector and a highly adaptable individual, Bill always brings a fresh perspective to the challenges and opportunities that he is involved with. A frequent keynote speaker and participant at many industry events, a constant champion of change, and an outspoken advocate for a better construction industry, Bill believes in always pushing past the status quo for opportunity, no matter what the challenges may be. All right, just a quick reminder to the audience to please always mute your microphone. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat, and the session moderator will ask these questions at the end of the session. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Bill Black.
Thank you very much. It's great to be able to participate, and I've kind of bitten off a rather big subject. And as I was joking earlier, this stuff is so volatile right now that my presentation is going to be out of date before I'm halfway through, just at the rate things are changing. But it's no secret, obviously, that we have some significant challenges with unprecedented levels of cost escalation and some very alarming trends in and unpredictability in terms of lead times in the supply chain in general. And, you know, it's easy to kind of say this guy's to blame because it's kind of happened on the back end of COVID, so to speak. And, you know, COVID gets blamed for a lot of things, rightfully so, but this isn't completely due to COVID. COVID has brought about circumstances, but there's many others in play. And of course, we first really heard about this as regards lumber. You know, when you were spending $100 for a sheet of plywood at Home Depot, all of a sudden people were getting really quite wound up and concerned at what that was doing to whether you were just a private homeowner doing some renos because you needed something to do during COVID, or whether you were a contractor. Worse still, as a career estimator, there's nothing worse than this level of uncertainty when you're bidding on a project, because very often you're bidding on a project that by the time your bid is accepted and the project is built, if you're a trade like roofing or even furniture that's quite late on in the process, you might be 12 to 15 months away from actually doing the work. And right now, don't ask me to guess what stuff's going to cost, or even if I can get it, even in that time frame in some cases. Back in June, the Calgary Construction Association and the Edmonton Construction Association, we kind of partnered on putting together a report to really try and get a handle on this on behalf of our members and the industry. And so we collaborated with a number of industry folks who had been gathering data. We had run an article in March around the rising cost of steel. And so we've been trying to stay on top of this, and things had started to settle down, or so we thought. But as you'll see from some of the numbers, it's by no means done, and it might get worse before it gets better. But as we kind of looked at this and started to learn a little bit, it wasn't just about the cost of plywood in Home Depot or whatever. It was a much more complex scenario that covered multiple building materials, and the causes were really quite complex. It's easy to turn around and say, oh, it's just the construction industry gouging us again, which many people did say, and many people are still saying. But as a champion of the construction industry, I think I can safely say, whilst gouging may happen now and then, and there may be some less ethical players in the marketplace, right now in the city of Calgary, we've undergone 6 years of declining margins and declining revenues because the economy has been tight. No contractor is going to unnecessarily price themselves out of work just because they want to get a little bit greedy. These are real cost increases that have to be passed on. And they kind of fall into 3 buckets. There's your typical influences of material costs and lead times, etc. COVID did create some unprecedented demand, particularly in the homeowner world. Massive amount of home renovation projects going on. And you know, just because Calgary's market was down, markets like BC and Vancouver and Toronto, just from a Canadian perspective alone, were much heavier volumes, and still are compared with what we're doing. But you got your typical huge increase in demand that then was combined with compromised supply. So it wasn't just that the supply couldn't keep up, the supply was compromised in addition to that. There's obviously regional differences depending on how close you are to some of the manufacturers and how much stuff is manufactured in China, which creates another logistical problem. We had the tariffs issue going on that was happening, that was affecting pricing. Many construction materials use commodities such as steel and copper and aluminum. And so the commodity price is a typical influencer of material price. But most manufacturers can hedge against that. And so, you know, you don't tend to see that happening. The commodity price jumps tomorrow, you don't suddenly see a price increase, but now some of that quick turnaround reaction is happening. And then the cost of logistics obviously impacts the cost of materials. We're starting to see fuel surcharges again. And there's other challenges in the logistics world. There's not enough truckers. The backwards and forwards of materials that normally occurred isn't happening. For instance, when you ship something up here from Vancouver, you normally only pay for one way because they're backhauling another load from here back down there. Well, the backhauling wasn't happening with the same rhythm as the shipping. And so the cost, many people were having to pay for the full return trip, as well as the additional fuel costs. And then a shortage of truckers. I mean, the UK is way worse than we are, but it's hard to find truckers for long haul. It's easier to find them within city limits, but it's hard to find them for long haul. Then there's some contextual influences, some things that were not used to happening around us that had the same kind of impact. We had a bunch of remote and disparate events. We had storms that shut down factories. We had fires. We had all kinds of events that contributed and compromised the supply of raw materials or the manufacturing of products, etc. A lot of manufacturers had to change their inventory practices where with very, very effective trucking, I mean, all you have to do is be an Amazon Prime member to realize just how efficient trucking and logistics have become, especially in North America. But as the ability to move stuff and the demand and supply got compromised, people were having to inventory more so they could protect themselves from the shortages, while inventory requires carrying costs, which has to be passed on. And then there are more and more organizations that have relied on offshoring for manufacturing or offshoring to reduce costs because labor is cheaper abroad, are starting to move the manufacturing or the labor closer. So nearshoring to more stable parts of the world, or reshoring, bringing it back within the confines of your own country. All these things take time, they cost money, and if the labor cost is higher, albeit more secure, again, it shows up in material prices. And then another contextual thing is there's a bit of a correction going on. Prices were unrealistically low in many aspects of the industry. Prices had been pushed down and practices had pushed them down to below where they should have been. So there's a bit of correction going on. So even if this settles down and material prices come back down, they're probably not going back down to where they were in most, if not all cases, because they were unrealistically low in the first place. And then there's some hidden things that maybe weren't obvious to us, but when you start pulling back the layers, you can see the effect that they're having. Procurement practices that have been pushing more and more to the low bid, the low price, everybody's cutting corners, has cut margins. It has created some of that unrealistically low costs. And that has put pressure on the industry that is now potentially showing up, not as gouging, but it's kind of a bit of a backlash from years of too much pressure the wrong way that was pushing and forcing the industry into a race to the bottom, which is not sustainable for any industry, certainly not ours. The subsidies that were in place, wage subsidies, and the sort of the Trudeau dollars that some people call them, paying people to stay at home, meant that it was hard to get them back to work, which has compromised trucking and the access to labor, trades, et cetera, and everybody's waiting to see if the predictions around the Great Resignation is going to they are going to happen, and who knows what that might do to disrupt the labor market still further. And then there's quite a significant amount of national hoarding and or protectionism going on. A lot of US manufacturers, for instance, are holding on to what inventory they have for their American customers. And yeah, if we have any left when we're done, you can have it, but you can't. We won't be able to tell you for 300 days. In China, they are holding on to certain core materials because they don't want to compromise their own construction volume and their own abilities. And so that plays into this game as well. Basically, it's dominoes. One thing happens and it has a knock-on effect that creates another unexpected change, another unexpected impact. And the further you are down the supply chain from the initial event, the more that will have accumulated in cost burdens between the raw material and you, and the bigger the challenge that you're going to be faced with. Commodity prices fluctuate. Whether it's steel, copper, or aluminum, as I said, these are just seasonal changes. You know, from a construction perspective, a lot of materials do annual increases. You would expect seasonal increases on materials. Drywall, you'd often get a price increase in the first quarter. Many other manufacturers would do the same thing. You knew that was coming, so as you approached that time as an estimator, you would start making allowances. You would start getting a feel for what you thought it was going to be. It was often 3 to 5%. Rare, you know, these were common numbers, so you could make some good predictions. If you were getting really close to the date, you could call your manufacturers and you could get project pricing, which gave you a bit of protection. That's gone, because some of these construction materials, you know, we're only partway through the year, and some of them have had 5, 6 or more price increases, and they come with no warning and they're effective almost immediately, which is really, really tough to manage. And, you know, when we talk about disparate events, when we heard that there were severe winter storms in Texas that led to major ice and freeze up issues and the closing of resin factories, we said, oh, you know, that must be rough for the Texans on the Gulf. They don't normally get ice. None of us who were not directly involved in the stream of products that come and are resin dependent, we didn't realize that this was going to affect vinyl windows, pipe, vinyl siding, engineered wood products, insulation, roofing membranes, and many, many other byproducts of the resin. And then there was a fire at another facility in California. So you've got a major building raw material that's compromised maybe a dozen or more different other product lines. And these are the events that we're having to pay attention to, because we need to start making the connection so we can predict what maybe hasn't come yet. But, you know, whether it's electrical wiring, you know, again, these things, the amount of things that one simple event has impacted is incredible. And it still is. We're not far off a year since it happened, and we're still seeing these issues. The other problem is shipping containers. You know, there's a whole slew of stats around shipping containers. The main way stuff moves around the world, especially when so much of it is manufactured in other countries. The average cost of a shipping container has gone from 5,000 or less to 20 grand. That's over a 400% increase just in the cost. And that is if you can get one. Right now, the situation at the ports, there are 500,000 containers sitting in ships waiting to offload in the port of Los Angeles alone. There are as of Monday, there are 159 ships sitting waiting to be offloaded because there's no space at the port. But that also means all these containers are not getting back to Asia to be filled up with more materials to be brought over. And so you're seeing this accumulation of useless containers. The Port of Vancouver, the dwell time, which is the time it takes for it to be offloaded and then moved out on a train, is 5 to 7 days. And the port is currently operating at 102% of capacity. So start doing your Christmas shopping, because everybody's predicting that it could be an empty shelf Christmas on many fronts. The national hoarding, it's not just Trump that started it. It's been happening in Asia, etc., which, you know, those that have are able to hoard and restrict what gets to those that need it. And the variety of building materials that it has affected is very broad. And this probably isn't an exhaustive list, but, you know, I was speaking to somebody this morning. He's been in the curtain wall and glazing industry for 40 years. And he's like, aluminum is currently the highest it's ever been in history. They are having to order raw aluminum profiles the minute they get a project award. They would normally wait until they did shop drawings and had a more accurate read on what they needed, but they're ordering materials because they're not sure if it will be available, never mind what it's going to cost. There are buildings downtown, I was hearing, that have scheduled phased window upgrades and window replacements, etc., because they're old, their seals have gone, etc. They're starting to order all the glass for the building and stock it. So that carries a price, because you're not able to phase the acquisition, and you're having to pay to store it and then install it in the phases that they wanted, but they're pre-ordering to secure it. Silicone, 80% increase in the cost of silicone. And we're like, well, what does that affect? Well, that affects glazing, that affects roofing, that affects tiling. It's a building product that's utilized everywhere, and it's a bigger cost component than we realize, especially when it jumps 80%. Concrete. A lot of concrete powder, cement powder, comes from Asia. Well, that supply has been impacted through a combination of shipping issues and hoarding. And so that can lead to rationing of product. I was speaking to one concrete manufacturer in town, and he was telling me that their folks were banging the sides of the silos with steel bars to knock any of the powder that was stuck to the sides, because they were literally down to the dregs due to the shortage of raw powder supply. Copper, obviously a very highly volatile commodity, which goes directly into the cost of electrical components and wiring. Fasteners, a fastener shortage of all things. You know, nobody expected a fastener shortage. The roofers were the first to mention it. Any of their mechanically fastened systems, people were buying up fasteners, and it's a toilet paper scenario. People were hoarding and buying massive amounts and sitting on them out of sort of controlled panic, so to speak. And then, as I mentioned before, resin-based products, vinyl windows, engineered wood, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, that's the raw materials such as steel, but open web steel joists earlier this year. Open web steel joists are you almost order them out of catalog. They are standardized products, and you work out what span you need and what load you need, and you order a model number basically. Traditionally, for years, they ran an 8-week lead time. Earlier this year, in around June, July, they suddenly went to a 50-week lead time. You're talking about a 1-year delay to a project. The bridge in Inglewood that they were just mentioning on the news this week in Calgary, massive delays due to being able to get a hold of steel. So it's right on our doorstep. This isn't just something that's happening elsewhere. However, and I know, I think there is another session on this subject as part of the program, but the reality is material issues, supply chain issues, shipping and logistics, cost of fuel, et cetera, et cetera. These things will in time stabilize. They always do. Factories will start running extra shifts. People will build more factories. More raw materials will be produced. The ports will eventually deal with their capacity issues. Containers will be offloaded. They will be returned back. Shipping materials back. They'll be available to then bring more stuff our way. That will solve itself in time. It will be painful, frustrating, challenging, et cetera, but it will end. All like even COVID and these crises, they will end. The real crisis that's also affecting this cost issue and lead time issue is labor. And you can't, so far anyway, nobody's worked out how to build factories to make people. And the labor challenge is not so easily fixed. Construction industry has been talking about the labor challenge since the early 90s. The concern over construction not being a first choice of career, a sort of last resort for people. The stigmatization of construction has not gotten any better. And there's, you know, the average age of tradespeople in certain industries is in the mid-50s. So they're all going to retire. What happens when they retire? And there's not an influx of new folks coming out of high schools, et cetera, that want to enter either the trades or the project management, estimating, and other careers associated with the industry. And so everywhere that I'm, you know, looking now, everybody's talking about the labor issue. Can't find people. I might have to turn down a job because I can't find a plumber. I need to put together another crew so I can take on work, because work is starting to come back. There are projects out there. And when it comes down to the cost of this, labor can be as much as 70% of the cost of a building, depending on the complexity of it and the nature of it. So if labor is compromised the same way that some of the materials have been compromised, we have likely a longer problem on our hands, and something that we've been talking about for 30 years and we haven't solved it. So we're not going to solve it by Christmas, but we're going to have to get about it fast. And I mean, just the numbers related to construction labor. Jerry Crawford put together an article that we published in our newsletter a couple of weeks ago on this very subject. And these are some of the numbers. Thank you, Jerry. You're making me look smart again. But there are 1.5 million people employed in the construction industry in Canada. 87.4% of them are men, 12.6% are women. 240,000 people employed by the construction industry in Alberta. 40,000 of them are expected to be retired by 2030. 2030 used to sound a long way off, and it sure isn't now. And about 80,000 of them are employed in the residential, but you can see that little graphic on the side. And if you go to our website, you can see more of the detail that Jerry put together as part of that article. But this is very much an issue that we can say we didn't see the storms in Texas coming. We certainly didn't see COVID coming, but we've been watching this train coming at us for 35 years. And now it's very, very close. It's 1 minute to midnight, basically, to steal a line from the climate change folks. So what are some of the things we can do? There's a lot of different things that we need to do. And a lot of it starts with the owners, because the owners are the ones that create the demand, so to speak. And they're the ones with the procurement practices that maybe have not been very adaptable to this reality. And some of the things that need to be considered, people are going to have to spend more time in the design process, spend a bit more energy understanding the buildings they're designing and doing a lead time assessment and being open to alternates as they learn how the design intent may be impacted by some of these issues. You can't just use a bunch of stuff from your standard AutoCAD library and use a familiar spec document and slam something out on the street. You're going to have to take some extra time to understand how it might be impacted, because it's not the custom stuff that has the long lead time. It's not the Italian marble or the bespoke elements of your building that are the lead time anymore. It's silicone, it's concrete, it's steel, etc., etc. Another thing that owners are going to have to consider is you're not going to be able to have a 90-day award period in a climate like this, because nobody can hold their prices that long. And so you're going to have to reevaluate your turnaround time. You might even have to consider sequential awards. You might need to award the steel contract early so that the steel can be pre-ordered. You might have to have people pre-order, and then you may have to pay them early, and you might have to pay for storage just so you can secure the materials and create some predictability and mitigate the risks on the project. And ultimately, as owners are going to have to decide, how do they want to deal with the cost risk? Owners have spent the last 25 years making sure they carry as little risk, if any, as possible. And they have done everything they can to mitigate cost risk and pass it downstream. The problem is this cost risk is now so extreme that if you can find somebody willing to take it on, they are probably carrying such a contingency against this risk that it's going to have a massive impact on skewing the cost of your project. And the challenge there is, if they don't need that whole contingency because the product didn't end up costing as much more as they thought, then you're paying whether it goes up in price or not. So, you know, a very uncomfortable practice, but probably the most realistic one, is in times of high escalation, whether it's market economics or materiality, as we're talking about today, ask for today's price and then deal with fluctuations in an open book nature. When I started in a quantity surveying office in Edinburgh in 1981 as a bright, fresh-faced, naive, unspoiled 17-year-old, that didn't last long, by the way. One of my first jobs was what we called fluctuations. And that was in the early 80s when this kind of stuff was a real challenge as well. And my job was to check all the unit rates that had been put in the bid for all the key components and the key materials, and check them against invoices that were being submitted to prove what was being paid, and then apply the fluctuations to the quantities on the project so that the contractors were being reimbursed for any price increases that happened. But they were also being paid less if things went the other way. And the owner had to carry an added contingency because they knew there was going to be increases. but at least they had the peace of mind at the end of the day of knowing they only paid the difference between bid price and actual price at time of purchase. They weren't paying somebody's sort of fat and contingency, somebody's gouging, to use the expression I mentioned earlier that has come up. They paid for what it cost based on the action, but they got the best price day one, which meant they had comfort with the transparency. That's the antithesis of the way procurement has evolved over the last few years. But it is a necessary consideration if one wants to create some certainty and manage the risk realistically. Because at the end of the day, no matter how many contract clauses that you add, no matter how many things you try to push down to your suppliers, to your contractors, to their suppliers, nobody can control what their supply chain can't control. If my roofing distributor is told by Firestone Building Products that their TPO membrane is now on a 300-day lead time, no contract can undo that. If another fire happens in a major factory and shuts down production of a major building component, if rock sill is not available at all, which was the case for a while, and some people are still suffering the challenge of getting rock sill insulation, no contract can force you to comply. So, you know, the reality is contractors can only mitigate so much. They have no fat, no margin to absorb anything else. And they can't control the things that are impacted by world events, climate events, pandemics, et cetera, and there are owners out there, some of them public, some of them private, who think they can put clauses into contracts that completely insulate them from this stuff, and absolutely not. There's no way. And if you're not realistic, you're either not going to get bids, or you're going to get bids for people that are crazy, which means they may not last long enough to finish your building, or you will get massively inflated bids that are totally unrealistic. One of the things we might have to consider, the ability to turn around and build cheap, marginally code compliant buildings, which has been a common practice for a long time, may not be possible anymore. We're looking at massive vacancy rates in downtown Calgary, and a huge problem for the city in that the property tax revenue has dried up. But the bigger problem is what you do with vacant buildings that may not be filled again. Even if oil and gas comes back, they've learned how to get incredibly lean over the last few years. They may not come back at the volumes of people that they had before, because they've got incredibly efficient at surviving through an extended period of low oil prices. But the other problem is with climate issues, whether we like it or not, and our mayor is learning how many people don't like the subject right now. But the reality is, if Calgary is one of the last major cities in Canada to acknowledge a climate emergency and start acting on it, it's only a matter of time before we either get left so badly behind we can't compete, or it'll come at us in a way that we can't control. And so if materials are hard to get a hold of, if labor is even harder to get a hold of, if the need to build better buildings becomes a reality, it may change a lot of how our industry has evolved over the last, especially the last 15, 20 years. A lot of the problem we have downtown is a lot of these buildings were built, you know, as low cost as possible, as was feasible at the time. And now upgrading them is virtually impossible in some cases. And if it is possible, it's an extreme intervention that's needed, because the buildings weren't necessarily built to adapt to energy use expectations, to a need to reduce our energy footprint. And the climate resilience group at the city has identified that residential and non-residential buildings account for 69% of Calgary's carbon footprint. So the opportunity for our industry is great. It's extreme, because we have the subject matter experts to participate in this. And we need to get a handle on materiality, lead times, labor and skill. And because the opportunity for our industry and the amount of work that's going to be needed to build back some of these buildings and continue to grow Calgary, which is now predicted to grow to 2 million people over the next few years. I think, you know, if we get our hands around this, Calgary is used to boom and bust and used to these big cycles. This material and lead time issue, it's just a cycle. We're very well experienced in how to adapt to cycles. In the past, it's been oil and gas and energy industry cycles, but now it happens to be construction materials and availability crisis. It's a great time for those in the industry and those entering the industry, because I think we're about to enter a new chapter of performance and skill-based work that will contribute to Calgary in incredible ways and build great careers for people. So I look forward to being a part of that. And that was my slides and such for today. And I haven't been able to track questions, etc. But if there are any questions or thoughts, or if you have any tips for me, because Calgary Construction Association, we are currently looking at, based on what we're hearing and what we're seeing, we're working with some partners and some folks in our membership to probably start publishing at least monthly some key cost index and supply issue indexes and stats, so that we can help our members stay on top of some of these things, and owners and design firms stay on top of what's happening, so we're all that little bit more educated and a bit more prepared. So if you have any thoughts about that, or if anybody wants to participate, one of my favorite things is working with others. So welcome to the party. We'd love to have you involved. But if you got any thoughts or questions now, I'm more than happy to do my best.
If you like to ask the question in person, I can give the mic to you. Anybody? So
yeah, I did have a question. Can you hear me, Phil?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I can, Jerry.
So a lot of times the contract documents always have the baseline schedule. And my thoughts the last probably 6 months would be owners and people in supply chain, they'd like to be prudent to request contractors submit their own practical schedules versus this is the contract baseline schedule. Do you have anything you want to add to that, or would you support that?
Well, I certainly think that's part of that's totally valid, because like I said, you can't control what others can't control. And you know, the challenge is when people are in business development mode, they'll say, oh yeah, we can do it. They'll wait till they get in the door, then they'll tell you why something you know has led to they can't do it. The risk is you get misled. But it's also part of what I mentioned earlier about when you're doing your design, you need to be making assessments on core aspects of your building and getting a realistic assessment that would inform the actual products and materials, but also the schedule that can be expected and how you might need to position your awards, etc., to be able to overcome some of these challenges. I mean, I remember way back when I was with Skyline Roofing and we put the roof on the SMED facility at the time, it was SMED, out in the southeastern foothills for Leadcore. That way back then, all the steel, my understanding was all the steel for that building was awarded months in advance. And so that the steel guys could get their fabrication drawings done and place their orders so that the high volume of steel required for a 700,000 square foot building would be there on time and would not impede such a critical component on the schedule. So yeah, you know, you're going to have to find out what it really means and adjust accordingly. What happens when your open web steel joists are 50-week lead time and it used to be 8?
Thank you, Bill. Any others? If you want, you
I've got a quick question for you, Bill.
Mhm.
Does the CCA invest in like green technologies, like as material manufacturers? Because I know of quite a few new up and coming technologies that kind of helps create certain building materials in a sustainable way. Does the CCA have any kind of interest in that?
Well, I mean, really, from the CCA perspective, we're there to support our members, and our members are everybody in the non-residential sector generally. And it's a broad range from the very largest of the construction general contractors all the way down right through all the trades, and some of them are, you know, literally small owner operator businesses. And so we're always trying to keep ahead of the curve on their behalf and understand what these are. But any direct, and we tend not to, we resist the temptation to tell our members how to run their business because it's theirs, it's not ours. But we are trying to find more and more ways to be fact finding for them, to be introducing them to folks that may have, whether it's manufacturing of unique materials that respond to some of these sustainability issues, or whether it's technologies and apps that can allow them to run a more effective operation. We're constantly trying to at least make them aware of these things so they can avail themselves, kind of be their eyes and ears.
Awesome, thank you.
No, thank you.
So Bill, there's another question from Spencer Andreasen. So he's asking, in your conversations with the industry partners, what rates are you seeing PMs carry in project budgets for cost escalation?
I have no visibility of what people are carrying. That's not a part of the industry I get exposed to anymore. I would have been able to answer that 3 or 4 years ago when I was more directly involved in the industry itself. But from where we sit, I, at this point, have not had conversations in that regard. I can remember back in 2007, 2008, when our escalation was nuts here because construction was booming and there was more work than there were people to do it. People were carrying 2 to 3% a month escalation just for economic impact of people pricing higher because they didn't need the work as badly. But as to what people are carrying now, I suspect they have no idea what to carry, and they're scared to carry too much in case they kill the project. Because that's the other thing that, you know, we didn't kind of go through here is the really scary part is just as we're at the cusp of business coming back again, we could have such a challenging risk scenario that people potentially start to cancel or delay projects just when we're getting ready for things to improve. So I unfortunately, I have no visibility of that at this time, but based on your question, that might be one of the things that we may need to do some investigation on and include in the reporting that we're hoping we might be able to provide to our members on a monthly basis.
Thanks, Bill. Anybody else who'd like to present their questions?
Actually, you know, one thing I think is it's going to take a while for some of the owners to realize they can't pass the cost escalation on to the trades and the contractors. Perhaps right now, some of them think that the industry will take on that risk and that contingency for them, and they don't need to. I don't think that practice is going to last. I don't think it can. It's not sustainable.
Thanks, Bill. I have one of my own questions. Now, in the light of this, you know, we can also, you know, what is going on with the COVID and whatnot. There will be disruptors to how we contract in the construction industry. How do we deliver projects? Do you see the practices of contracting and project delivery changing in the near future? If so, who would be taking the lead in that area?
Well, ultimately, I've spent many years talking around North America about things like integrated project delivery, more collaborative delivery, and major changes in practice. And whilst there's a role for industry to play, at the end of the day, it's rather brutally simple. If the owners don't get on board, it probably won't happen. The owners have to make the decision that, you know, the old saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. If the owners are not willing to change the way they contract and the way they engage and the manner in which they put projects together, then it may not matter what the industry tries to do. There are those in the industry that are trying and they're having some success in showing owners, you know, progressive design build, integrated project delivery, and you know, enhanced construction management, that there's more transparency, there's more open book, there's earlier involvement of key participants, a bit more design assist, where you bring some of your key trades on earlier and have them participate and collaborate on the design, which is another way to manage uncertainty, because they're able to give you constructability and cost implications at the same time as you're making design decisions. These are absolutely ways in which these challenges can be mitigated. But I could have spent an hour ranting and raving about procurement. The problem is the procurement practices that have evolved have gone the exact opposite way, where really the concept of design and construction has been widgetized. It's the same approach to procurement, frankly, as stationery, pens and pencils. And you shouldn't be procuring intelligence and expertise as a widget. You should be hiring it and bringing it on board at the time it can bring the most value to the table, which is the earliest. If anybody's seen the Patrick McLeamy curve, Patrick McLeamy with HOK, it's a very well-used graph that basically shows that the early involvement, the more you invest up front in design and in due diligence and in making decisions, and to Jerry's point, setting up your schedule, that's when you have the maximum ability to impact the outcome is early. After a certain point, you have little or no ability to impact the outcome, and now you're held ransom. But ultimately, it's owners that have to make a lot of the decisions to contract differently, and their procurement methods don't really facilitate that very well.
Thank you. That's a really, comprehensive, good answer. I appreciate it. Anybody else?
By the way, nobody's going to believe I finished early. Just, anybody who knows me is going to, Bill Black finished early. Are you kidding
Early?
me?
Yeah.
What's wrong with him?
Bill, one other question. Jerry again. Do you find the IPD model might be better at managing and appreciating some of these logistic challenges and labor challenges?
Well, all the examples I've heard of IPDs like anything, if it's done badly, it sucks just as badly as everything else. And there's plenty of examples of it not being done well. But when it has been done well, you know, major risks have been mitigated because everybody has skin in the game. Nobody can shed the risk to some other poor, unsuspecting party because the risk is on the table and it's visible. And so if it's done well, and if the right parties are involved and the right methods and lean and other principles are employed, yeah, I believe that these things can be handled well. Progressive design build and really good CM can also bring about similar values. But if you do full integrated project delivery, where people are in a shared risk, shared reward, and they've actually got skin in the game, in many cases, that's what takes it to the next level. And you find trades that never talk to each other are sitting down working out better ways to do the building. You know, for instance, you know, it's a simple illustration, but you know, on a project that has masonry, stucco, cladding, windows, and curtain wall, a group of all the separate trades, each one of them had vapor barrier in their scope. Each one of them had to tie into the next guys. And one of the common failures on a building is lack of continuity of air barrier. Especially in this climate, it's such a big issue. Well, they get together on an IPD project and they say, who's got the biggest scope out of all of us? That one entity should do the air barrier for everybody. So there's one consistent, they saved money because everybody wasn't carrying the waste of all the overlaps. It was the one single entity. There's a big risk that was dealt with successfully because it was about what's best for the project, not, oh no, that's mine, that's my scope, like the seagulls in Finding Nemo. It was what's best for the project. The best thing is one entity does one single consistent air barrier and is willing to take responsibility from continuity of the wall air barrier, from where it ties into the roof air barrier to where it ties in at the base of the building. So with that kind of an example applied to this kind of challenge, I believe it is, when properly done, it is highly capable of overcoming some really nasty challenges that we get tired of seeing on every project.
Well put. Thank you.
So we have some more time for a couple of more questions. Anyone? So if that's the case, I'd like to ask another question, Bill. You touched on this subject earlier, this trade barriers, tariffs, trade agreements. But there's a, I've heard that there are more barriers for trade amongst the provinces, in addition to the international agreements and trade barriers, tariffs, and all that. Has interprovincial trade barriers affected construction industry, or does it have is it having a bearing on what's happening these days in the industry?
It's always a bit of an issue because I'm not aware of specific trade issues necessarily, but there are some provinces that have more work, and so the labor follows the work. Because if I'm a tradesperson and I'm working in the field, I need hours, and if the hours are not here, I go to the province or the city or the location where I know I can get my 2,200 hours a year fairly confidently, because I have to make mortgage payments, I have to support myself and my family, etc. There is a little bit of issue with other provinces coming in and poaching work. That's always a bit of a stress, but it happens between cities as well. It's not just it's not just province to province. There's always a little bit of tension, and some are more collaborative than others. One of the realities in Alberta is we're largely non-unionized outside of the industrial sector up north. And so, there's that maybe cuts down on a little bit of the traffic backwards and forwards, because it's harder for unionized entities potentially to gain a foothold in a largely non-unionized environment in the commercial sector. But the funny thing is, normally our worst enemy is ourselves. There's a practice starting to happen, and I heard about this last Friday, that employers that don't have vaccination policies are going to employers who do have vaccination policies and stealing their people. Well, if you don't want to be forced to get vaccinated, come and work for us, because we're never going to do that. So there's a lot of behavior. And it's funny, I said at a presentation recently that we often blame the owners or we blame others because we think they treat us badly, but it doesn't matter what they do to us. It's going to be nothing like as bad as what we do to ourselves. And these kind of things are happening, unfortunately.
Thank you, Bill. I think we can take another question. Anyone? Any questions?
There's no way I exhausted the subject, so.
No way, yeah. But it was a very eye-opening, enlightening presentation and the discussion. I myself enjoyed listening to your presentation, and how you covered all the aspects of this cost escalation and supply chain issues. So I'd like to thank you for
Thank you.
presenting to us today and all your support towards the SAIT and our BCPM program here as
Absolutely.
well. So also on behalf of SAIT, I'd like to thank you. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. And the next sessions will start in, it's at 2:30, I believe. So there are a couple of good presentations coming, and I encourage you to participate. Thank you. Bye for now. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks for letting me be a part of it. Good luck to you and the rest of the day. And let's hope next year is in person.
Absolutely. Will do. Thank you.
Thanks
Take
so much,
care,
Bill.
Thank you, Samara.
Goodbye. Good luck to all. Stay well.